year 1792 marked a turning point in American history. Kentucky, once a rugged frontier of wilderness, bloodshed, and survival, officially became the 15th state of the Union. For most settlers, this new land was a place of opportunity, fertile soil, endless forests, and a chance to escape the old world's oppression. But beneath the fertile fields and silent woods, Kentucky held secrets that even the bravest pioneers whispered about only at night. The frontier was not just a land of promise, it was a land of fear. Settlers spoke of strange disappearances, families that seemed cursed, and bloodlines that carried unnatural traits. Local legends described hollow-eyed children who aged too fast, men who whispered to unseen voices, and women who seemed to vanish only to return with wild, animal-like behaviors. It was in this very year, 1792, that the name Hartwell began to spread across Kentucky. On the surface, they appeared like any other wealthy frontier family. Landowners, stern in manner, bound by tradition and devoted to keeping their lineage pure. But behind the walls of their estate, darkness lurked. Their neighbors noticed unsettling patterns. No outsiders ever married into the Hartwell bloodline, and those who dared to get close often vanished without a trace. The Hartwells were different. Their faces carried a strange symmetry that unsettled the eye. Their voices had an uncanny softness, as if spoken from another world. And worst of all, their children were not like others. Some appeared physically deformed, others mentally unstable, yet the family always hid them away, claiming sudden deaths or illnesses when curious eyes asked too many questions. Kentucky's wilderness became a perfect hiding place for their secrets. And as the state entered its birth year, the Hartwell family began weaving a legacy that would become one of America's most disturbing genetic mysteries. From the earliest days of mankind, families have carried both blessings and curses in their blood. Royal dynasties of Europe suffered from hemophilia due to inbreeding. Ancient tribes told stories of children born with monstrous features, said to be punishments from the gods. But the Hartwells of Kentucky represented something far darker, a deliberate obsession with blood purity, no matter the cost. The family's patriarch, Silas Hartwell, believed that their bloodline was sacred, untouched, chosen, and destined to remain pure. He forbade marriages outside the family and forced cousins to wed, creating a cycle of inbreeding that spanned generations. Neighbors called it arrogance, but whispers soon grew that Silas believed the family's strength came from a supernatural source, a pact made long before they arrived in Kentucky. At first, the results of their breeding obsession were hidden. A few sickly children, explained away as frail, but soon the horrors could no longer be disguised. Some Hartwell children were born with twisted spines, others with faces disturbingly similar to their parents, as if carved from the same mold. More chilling still, many displayed violent, animalistic behavior, attacking livestock or speaking in gibberish tongues no one understood, and yet the Hartwells insisted this was proof of their chosen nature. "The outside world cannot understand us," Silas once declared to his kin. "We are set apart." But to their neighbors it was clear. The Hartwells were cursed. Their blood carried something inhuman, something that twisted flesh, mind, and soul alike. As Kentucky's young state grew, the Hartwells became infamous. Families warned their daughters never to set foot near the Hartwell estate. Travelers told stories of screams echoing from the hills at night, of malformed shadows spotted at the edges of fields. The Hartwells remained silent, guarding their secret and guarding it well. Theirs was not just a story of sickness. It was a story of a family who embraced the curse of their bloodline, and in doing so, unleashed a nightmare that history has struggled to explain. By the turn of the century, the Hartwell estate had become a place of dread. Children dared one another to run past its gates, swearing they heard voices calling from inside. Farmers ploughing near the family's land claimed to see figures moving in the trees, not quite human, not quite beast. But the strangest tales came from hunters who ventured too far into the woods at night. They spoke of chanting carried on the wind, of glowing lights deep among the trees, and of figures kneeling in circles, their faces pale and identical in the moonlight. Some swore they saw Hartwell children with blackened eyes, moving in jerky, unnatural ways, as if their bodies were no longer their own. The townsfolk began to call it the Hartwell curse, but the family insisted it was nothing more than superstition. To them, their land was sacred, their rituals private. Outsiders, they claimed, simply could not comprehend the ancient knowledge they preserved. Yet records from the era show that local doctors were often summoned to the Hartwell estate, only to emerge pale, shaken, and refusing to speak of what they had seen. One physician, whose diary was later discovered, wrote a chilling line: "There are things in that house that do not belong to mankind. Flesh born of flesh, yet twisted beyond nature's law. I will never return." Still, the Hartwells grew in power. Their wealth increased, their land expanded, and despite their grotesque reputation, they held an unshakable influence over the county. Some whispered they had struck deals with powerful men, exchanging secrets for protection. Others believed no one dared move against them for fear of what the Hartwells might unleash. But one thing was certain: by 1792 and the years that followed, the Hartwell family had become a living legend of horror. Their bloodline a mystery too disturbing to ignore, yet too dangerous to expose. The Hartwell estate was vast, stretching across hundreds of acres of Kentucky wilderness. From a distance it looked like a place of dignity: rolling fields, smoke rising from chimneys, the faint sound of livestock. But neighbors whispered that if you walked too close you'd notice something wrong: the silence of children. Most frontier families were loud with the sounds of life. Children ran through fields, played with sticks and rocks, shouted across fences. But at the Hartwell home, children were rarely seen, and when they were, they did not play. They walked in groups, often holding hands, their heads bent low as if afraid of being seen. Their voices were rarely heard, and when they did speak, the words were unsettling, too formal, too old for their age, almost rehearsed. Local women who worked as maids told strange stories. They described children sitting for hours in silence, staring at walls as though listening to something unseen. They never laughed, they never cried. And if they were scolded, they did not protest like normal children. They simply nodded and obeyed, as though their will had been stripped away. Even more disturbing were the tales of children born deformed. One midwife, in her private notes, wrote of delivering a Hartwell child with skin so translucent you could see its veins, a head far too large for its body, and eyes that rolled back into its skull whenever light touched them. The infant lived only 3 days, yet the family buried it in secret, denying it ever existed. Why did this keep happening? Some said it was the curse of inbreeding, a punishment for the family's arrogance. Others whispered that the Hartwells were performing rituals on their infants, trying to preserve some unnatural purity of blood. But the most chilling rumor came from a runaway servant who claimed the Hartwells had children locked away in the attic, children who could not walk properly, whose faces twisted in unnatural ways, and who howled like animals in the night. The silence of the Hartwell children became a symbol of dread. While other families filled Kentucky with the sounds of new life, the Hartwells' halls remained heavy with an unnatural stillness, broken only by whispers, cries in the night, and the faint scratching of something in the walls. To outsiders, the Hartwells were simply eccentric landowners, but to those who lived closest, they were keepers of dark rituals. Hunters who lingered too long in the woods reported strange fires burning at midnight. Farmers swore they heard chanting rising from the hills, words in a language older than English, older than anything known to Kentucky settlers. Local folklore began to link the Hartwells to ancient European blood cults, secret societies that worshipped purity of lineage and sought forbidden knowledge through sacrifice. Whether true or not, the rumors spread like wildfire. One diary from 1796 belonging to a traveling preacher described an unsettling visit. "I was invited to the Hartwell estate under the pretense of prayer. What I found was not devotion to God, but to something else entirely. In their dining hall hung a tapestry of symbols I have never seen. At the table they drank from silver chalices and spoke of blood as if it were holy. When I questioned them, their eyes grew cold, and I felt as though I had been measured and found unworthy. I departed before night fell, for I feared what darkness would bring." The rituals, it seemed, were tied directly to the family's obsession with blood. Some accounts claimed the Hartwells performed bloodletting ceremonies on their own children, believing that by draining and consuming blood in secret rites, they could purify the body of weakness. Others whispered of animal sacrifices, their cries echoing through the woods, and of strange symbols carved into the trees near the estate. But perhaps the most disturbing detail came from servants, reports of masked gatherings in the grand hall. Every mirror in the house was covered during these nights, and candles lined the walls in hundreds. The family would dress in long, pale robes, their faces hidden, their voices chanting in low unison, and at the center of tone, a room, always a child, sometimes healthy, sometimes frail, sometimes one of their own. What happened to those children? History never fully recorded, but the chilling fact remains: too many Hartwell births ended with mysterious deaths, and neighbors swore that for every death the family grew richer, healthier, and more powerful. The rituals of the Hartwell family remain one of the most terrifying shadows of Kentucky's past, rituals that blurred the line between faith, madness, and something far more sinister. As the Hartwells' reputation grew darker, so too did the stories of people who ventured too close and were never seen again. It began with farmhands. Men hired to work the fields would suddenly vanish, their wages left unpaid, their belongings quietly returned to their families. The Hartwells insisted they had simply moved on, but whispers spread of workers being dragged into the estate and never coming out. Then it was travelers. Kentucky's roads in the late 1700s were dangerous, but when multiple traders disappeared near the Hartwell property, locals began connecting the dots. One merchant, last seen delivering fabrics to the estate, left behind only his cart, found abandoned, wheels still warm, horses restless, but no sign of the man. Even more disturbing were the disappearances of young women. Families spoke of daughters who had been courted by Hartwell men, only to vanish days later. The Hartwells would claim the woman had fallen ill and been sent away, yet no one ever saw them again. Their names vanished from church records. Their graves were never found. One chilling tale tells of Eleanor Price, a young woman engaged to marry into another prominent family. Days before her wedding, she accepted an invitation to the Hartwell estate. She never returned. Her family searched desperately, even organizing armed parties, but the Hartwells denied any knowledge of her whereabouts. Months later, a hunter found a torn piece of a bridal ribbon caught on the iron fence of the Hartwell property. Her body was never discovered. These disappearances grew so numerous that people began to avoid the roads near the Hartwell estate entirely. Some said the family was sacrificing outsiders in their rituals. Others believed they were using them to dilute and experiment with their bloodline. The fear became so great that mothers would warn their children, "Stay away from the Hartwells. If you go near, you'll never come home." By the early 1800s, the Hartwell name was no longer just a family. It had become a curse whispered on Kentucky's wind, a warning, a threat, and a reminder that some mysteries are too dangerous to approach. For years, rumors about the Hartwells were dismissed as superstition, but then came the journals, handwritten confessions from the very men who had been invited behind the Hartwells' closed doors. The most infamous belonged to Dr. Jonathan Harker, a young physician from Lexington who began visiting the Hartwell estate in 1797. His notes, found after his mysterious disappearance, remain one of the most chilling documents in Kentucky's archives. Harker described the estate as a house of shadows. He wrote of long corridors lined with locked doors and the echo of footsteps that never seemed to match his own. Servants whispered warnings to him when no one else was watching, telling him never to stay past sunset. But it was his encounters with the children that disturbed him most. He examined them for fevers, for weakness, but instead found traits he could not explain. He wrote, "The children's faces mirror one another too closely, as if they are the same soul born again and again into different bodies. Their skin is pale, their movements stiff. One child, no older than 6, spoke to me in Latin, a language he could not have learned naturally. When I asked where he had heard it, he smiled and pointed to the ceiling above, whispering, 'The ones who walk at night.'" Harker also described birth abnormalities so grotesque he refused to give detail, only hinting that they were evidence of nature's law being twisted beyond recognition. The doctor's journal ended abruptly. His last entry, dated September 12, 1799, read, "They invited me to observe a gathering tonight. The child at the center is not ill, it is something else. I feel I am being drawn into a circle that does not belong to God or man. If I do not return, let these words be my testimony." Dr. Harker was never seen again. His journal was discovered years later, hidden beneath floorboards in his abandoned practice. His disappearance only fueled the legend, convincing many that the Hartwells were hiding unnatural truths no outsider should ever see. Every town in Kentucky kept records of its dead, but in Hartwell land, graves told a different story. Travelers who passed the estate often spoke of a hidden cemetery deep in the woods, The graves were fresh, the soil unsettled, yet none bore names. Only small stones marked them, silent, anonymous reminders that something terrible had been buried. In 1801, a group of townsmen armed with lanterns claimed to have found this burial ground. According to their account, they counted dozens of graves, far too many for one family. Some graves were small, no larger than a cradle, suggesting infants. Others were larger, hastily dug, as though secrecy mattered more than respect. The men also described something far more sinister: unmarked crypts, carved into the hillside, sealed with iron doors. They tried to open them but failed. From within, one swore he heard the faint sound of scratching. Another claimed he smelled decay so foul it made him vomit. When they returned to town with their story, no one believed them. Within days, 2 of the men vanished. The third refused to speak again of what he had seen. Later records revealed that the Hartwells did indeed maintain a private family cemetery, but no church was ever allowed to consecrate it. Ministers were denied entry, funerals were conducted in secret, and no official records of the dead were kept. Why such secrecy? Some believe the Hartwells buried their malformed children there, hiding their failures from the world. Others insist the crypts held bodies that were not entirely human, creatures born of their cursed bloodline. One chilling account from 1805 tells of a storm that washed open part of the cemetery hillside. A traveler reported finding bones scattered in the mud, skulls that seemed too small, too thin, too deformed to belong to ordinary children. He claimed the bones were quickly gathered by Hartwell men and carried back into the woods. The cemetery without names remains one of the greatest mysteries. No map marks its location. No photograph or record proves it exists. Yet locals say that if you walk deep enough into the Kentucky forests near the old Hartwell land, you'll find places where the earth is disturbed, where the trees grow twisted, and where silence falls heavy, as if even nature refuses to speak of what lies below. Not all Hartwells were silent. Some grew older, lived longer, and began to reveal the true toll of their bloodline. Visitors in the early 1800s described the elder Hartwells as intelligent but strange. They spoke in riddles, often quoting from books that no one else in Kentucky had ever heard of. They claimed to see visions, to hear voices in the walls of their estate. One cousin, Edmund Hartwell, became notorious for his violent outbursts. At times he seemed brilliant, capable of reciting entire passages of scripture or foreign texts from memory, but then his eyes would glaze over, and he would mutter to himself in a language that no one understood. Witnesses said his pupils would dilate until his eyes looked entirely black, his voice dropping into a guttural growl. Edmund was eventually locked in a cellar beneath the estate, chained to the wall. Servants claimed they could hear him scratching symbols into the stone with his fingernails, symbols later described as resembling alchemical marks. When he finally died, his body was burned rather than buried. Unheard of in that era, a sign that even the Hartwells feared what he had become. Others in the family showed signs of madness too. Women were said to fall into trances, standing for hours at windows, whispering to the night. Children sometimes laughed at things no one else could see or drew pictures of creatures with elongated limbs and hollow faces. Doctors called it hysteria or madness of the blood, but neighbors believed it was the price of their obsession, a curse passed from mind to mind, twisting not just the flesh but the soul. What made it even more terrifying was the consistency. Madness did not strike randomly, it grew stronger in each generation. By the early 1800s, the Hartwell name was so tainted that even mentioning it in town brought shivers. Families refused to associate, fearing the curse might spread. And yet, the Hartwells endured. Their wealth insulated them, their secrets protected them, and their eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, remained the most haunting reminder of their legacy. In 1808, a stranger arrived in Kentucky claiming to have known the Hartwells in the Old World before they came to America. His name has been lost to history, but his testimony, written down by a local minister, remains. The stranger told of the Hartwells' origins in Europe, where they were part of a society obsessed with blood purity and forbidden knowledge. He claimed they were exiled not for their wealth or beliefs, but because of the monstrosities born within their family. Villages had accused them of witchcraft, of consorting with demons, of sacrificing children in pursuit of unnatural strength. They should never have been allowed to come here, the stranger warned. Their sickness is not of the body, but of the soul. Wherever they go, they will poison the land, and their curse will grow. At first, no one believed him, but then he produced something, a small leather-bound book filled with names, dates, and symbols. The minister who recorded the account described it as a ledger of births and deaths, written in a language neither English nor Latin, but older, like the tongue of Babel itself. The book vanished soon after, perhaps destroyed, perhaps stolen by the Hartwells, but the warning lingered. If the stranger spoke truth, then the Hartwells were not merely a Kentucky oddity. They were the continuation of an ancient curse, carried across oceans, planted in new soil, and left to fester. The minister who wrote the account ended his notes with a chilling reflection. If what the man says is true, then the Hartwells are not just a family. They are a vessel for something that waits generation after generation to be reborn in full. From that day forward, the Hartwells were no longer seen as eccentric neighbors or even cursed aristocrats. They were something far worse, a threat that had followed humanity across the sea, carrying with it secrets too dark to name. The Hartwell estate was not just a house. It was a labyrinth of secrets. Those who worked there whispered that behind locked doors and sealed chambers lay evidence of practices that no Christian family should ever touch. But the most unsettling detail came not from rumors, but from what was etched into the very walls. Servants who cleaned the lower halls reported finding symbols carved into the stone, markings that seemed neither decorative nor accidental, circles within circles, intersecting lines and strange runes no one recognized. Some resembled alchemical signs, others bore a frightening resemblance to occult scripts whispered about in Europe. One servant, Mary Collins, later confessed in an old age diary that she had seen a chamber entirely covered in these markings. She described the walls as being layered with symbols drawn in blood, the iron tang filling the air. In the center stood a wooden chair, its arms fitted with leather straps, as if it were built to hold someone down. The child screamed when they brought him in, she wrote. But when he came out, he was silent, and his eyes no longer looked like a child's at all. The markings grew stranger over time. Farmers who passed near the estate claimed to see trees carved with the same designs, as though the family had extended their ritual spaces into the wilderness itself. On nights when the moon was high, these trees seemed to glow faintly, though skeptics dismissed this as trick of the eye. But then came the discovery that terrified even hardened skeptics. In 1811, after a severe storm collapsed part of the Hartwell cellar, villagers who assisted in clearing the rubble stumbled upon a hidden passage. They reported finding chambers lined with etchings, but far worse were the remains inside, tiny bones arranged in patterns around the markings. The villagers fled, vowing never to return, but word spread. Quickly, the Hartwells were not merely cursed. They were keepers of an ancient, bloody language carved into their very home. Some scholars today speculate these symbols may have been attempts to record medical knowledge, primitive genetics, or even coded mathematics. But to those who lived near the Hartwells, the meaning was clear. The markings were not human writings. They were instructions left for something else, something the Hartwells served. By the 1810s, the Hartwells' obsession with blood was no longer just rumor. It became the subject of terrified testimony. Former workers, servants, and even relatives began to reveal fragments of the truth. The Hartwells were conducting experiments with blood itself. These accounts describe glass jars filled with preserved samples, kept in underground rooms where no sunlight reached. Servants spoke of children being bled with silver instruments, their blood collected and stored. The Hartwells claimed it was for healing, but the methods suggested something else entirely. One servant, who later fled to Ohio, claimed that the Hartwells mixed animal and human blood in ritual bowls, chanting as they observed the mixtures. Another reported that Silas Hartwell's descendants attempted to transfuse blood from one family member to another, believing it would carry the strength of the line forward. This was a century before science would experiment with transfusions, yet the Hartwells were already practicing, with horrifying results. Stories circulated of children who emerged from these treatments altered. Some grew violently aggressive, attacking their siblings like feral beasts. Others wasted away within weeks, their bodies shriveling as though drained of life itself. And yet, for every failure, the family proclaimed success. They insisted their methods would one day unlock the secret of eternal strength, perhaps even eternal life. But the darkest rumors went further still. Locals whispered that outsiders, the missing women and travelers, were used in these blood experiments, their veins opened, their life drained, their bodies discarded in nameless graves. Some even claimed that the Hartwells drank the blood, a ritual act to bind themselves closer to whatever force they worshipped. By 1815, Kentucky's clergy had taken notice. Ministers warned from pulpits that the old blood cults of Europe had taken root in their land. They urged families to keep their children away from the estate, to avoid traveling near it after dark. But the Hartwells were untouchable, wealthy, powerful, and shrouded in secrecy. No lawman dared confront them, and no neighbor dared speak too loudly. The truth of their experiments remains uncertain, lost in time and shadow, but one fact cannot be denied. Wherever the Hartwells lived, sickness followed. Fields near their estate grew barren. Cattle were born malformed. Children in neighboring homes grew ill without explanation. The land itself seemed poisoned, as though the blood the Hartwells spilled seeped into the soil, carrying their curse outward in every direction. Every cursed family has a figure who becomes its darkest symbol. For the Hartwells, it was Margaret Hartwell, the matriarch who presided over the estate in the early 1800s. Margaret was said to be a woman of great beauty in her youth, but by middle age, her appearance had twisted. Her skin grew pale and waxen, her eyes hollow, and her hair fell in clumps. Yet she carried herself with authority, her presence dominating every room. Servants described her as a queen of shadows, commanding both fear and obedience. What made Margaret infamous were her fits. Witnesses said she would collapse suddenly, her body writhing as though possessed. In these trances, she spoke in multiple voices, some high-pitched, others guttural and male. Sometimes she spoke languages unknown to anyone present, her words chilling those who heard them. Afterward, she would awaken calm, smiling faintly, as if nothing had happened. Neighbors began to whisper that she was the true power behind the Hartwells' rituals. They said she communed directly with the force the family served, acting as its vessel. Her daughters, too, seemed marked. 3 of them died before reaching 20, each after bouts of violent madness. Her surviving son was described as a boy with no soul behind his eyes. But perhaps the most terrifying account comes from the testimony of a servant who fled the estate in 1818. She claimed Margaret kept a mirror covered with black cloth in her chamber. On certain nights, she would remove the covering and stare into the glass for hours, speaking softly. The servant swore she once saw 2 reflections in the mirror, Margaret's face and another, darker face standing just behind her, whispering into her ear. When Margaret finally died in 1822, the family did not hold a funeral. Instead, they locked her body in a sealed chamber within the estate. Locals claimed that on stormy nights, her screams could still be heard echoing from beneath the ground. Margaret Hartwell's legacy was one of madness and terror. To this day, old Kentucky tales speak of the matriarch's curse, warning that to gaze too long into a mirror at night is to invite Margaret's dark companion to appear, and once seen, it never leaves. The Hartwell estate was infamous for its locked doors, its hidden rooms, and its labyrinthine cellars, but perhaps the most disturbing discovery came not from the main house, but from the small chapel the family had constructed on the edge of their land in 1804. On the surface, it appeared like any other frontier chapel. Whitewashed wood, a crude bell tower, and pews crafted by local carpenters. The family was known to attend service there each Sunday, their presence reinforcing the illusion that they were upright, God-fearing landowners. Yet the chapel hid a secret. In 1824, after the estate began falling into ruin, local boys dared one another to break into the chapel at night. They pushed open the rotting doors and crept down the narrow aisle. When one tripped, his hand struck a hollow section of the floorboards near the altar. Pulling the boards loose, they revealed a stone staircase leading underground. What they found below was no place of worship. The hidden chamber was low-ceilinged, its walls made of stone so old it predated the chapel itself. At its center stood an altar stained dark with blood, grooves cut into the stone to allow liquid to drain away. Surrounding the altar were shelves upon shelves of glass jars. Inside them floated organs preserved in yellow fluid, and rolls of parchment covered with symbols matching those found within the estate. The boys fled, but one swore he saw something else before escaping. A skeleton chained to the wall, its skull bound with iron bands, its jaw forced open by rusted clamps. When word spread, locals tried to dismiss the story as children's imagination, but whispers grew. How could the Hartwells pray above ground while keeping such horrors below? It was said that Margaret Hartwell herself led ceremonies in the underground chamber, mixing scripture with chants in a language no one recognized. Some even believed the chapel was never meant for God at all, but built as a mask to hide the true temple of their faith buried beneath the earth. Even after the Hartwells abandoned the land, travelers reported seeing faint candlelight flickering inside the chapel at night, though its doors were chained shut. And when storms rolled over the Kentucky hills, some swore they could hear voices rising from beneath the ground, chanting, pleading, weeping. To this day, the chapel ruins remain avoided, a place where children refuse to play and hunters refuse to tread. The hidden chamber is said to still be there, sealed in the soil, holding the secrets of the Hartwell rituals, secrets too dark to ever see the light of day. If the rituals and blood experiments were the Hartwells' public horror, their private one was even worse. Generations of secrecy had left them isolated, and whispers grew that the family began to turn inward, marrying cousins, sealing their bloodline into itself, and producing children marked with strange deformities. Local midwives who attended births in the surrounding villages occasionally received desperate summons from the estate. They were brought into rooms where curtains were drawn, and their task was not to deliver life but to dispose of failure. Many wrote in hushed and terrified journals that Hartwell infants were sometimes born with twisted spines, cleft jaws, and extra fingers. Some bore even more horrifying signs, eyes clouded black or limbs fused together like a grotesque parody of human form. These children were rarely seen again. Some say they were buried in shallow graves on the edge of the property. Others believe they were kept alive, hidden away in locked rooms deep within the estate, their cries muffled by stone walls. One account, passed down from a farmhand who worked near the estate, tells of a child with webbed hands and a jaw that jutted unnaturally forward. The boy was kept out of sight, but one evening escaped into the woods. When villagers caught sight of him, they mistook him for a creature, half boy, half beast, and fled in terror. The child was never seen again, though days later his body was supposedly found floating in the river, his chest carved with the same symbols that marked the estate walls. The Hartwells defended their secrecy by insisting that God had cursed their line with frailty, but many believed this was no curse. It was consequence, the result of inbreeding meant to preserve whatever purity they believed their blood held. Yet rather than breaking the cycle, they embraced it, claiming each new malformed child would be to somebodies. As closer to the design their family sought to perfect. By the 1830s, the inbred legacy of the Hartwells had become a legend in the region. Farmers spoke of hearing strange cries from the woods at night, cries that did not sound quite human. Hunters reported stumbling across footprints that began as human and ended as clawed. Some researchers suggest that the Hartwells were among the earliest recorded examples of genetic experimentation by isolation, their grotesque offspring, the unintended outcome of a deliberate plan. Others dismiss it as superstition, but in Kentucky folklore, the Hartwell brood still lingers, a reminder that when bloodlines are twisted too tightly, what emerges may no longer be human at all. Among the many artifacts whispered about in connection to the Hartwells, none is more infamous than the so-called Black Book of Hartwell. Legends say it was bound in leather so dark it seemed to swallow light, its pages brittle with age but filled with words that should never have been written. According to some, it was brought from Europe by Silas Hartwell himself, a family heirloom tracing back to medieval times. Others argue it was written in Kentucky, its pages filled by Margaret Hartwell during her trances. The book contained diagrams of human anatomy, written centuries before such knowledge was commonplace on the frontier. It described rituals requiring blood, bone, and fire. But most disturbing were the genealogical charts, pages mapping out the Hartwell family tree, annotated with strange markings. Each child born into the family was catalogued, not by name but by symbol, as though the book were less a record and more a breeding plan. Travelers claim to have seen the book once in the 1840s, when it was briefly displayed in a private collection. The witness described its language as a mixture of Latin, Greek, and something far older, and claimed that just holding it made his hands itch as though burned. The Black Book disappeared soon after. Some say it was stolen, others that the Hartwells reclaimed it and sealed it once more in the underground chambers. A few insist it never existed at all, and that the stories are simply Kentucky folklore spun out of fear. Yet one detail remains chillingly consistent. Every person who claimed to have handled the book reported nightmares that followed them for the rest of their lives. Dreams of shadowy figures whispering in the dark, dreams of being watched from mirrors, dreams of children crying beneath the floorboards. Even now, the Black Book of Hartwell remains a forbidden relic in regional legend. Hunters swear that if you call the Hartwell name 3 times while standing near the ruins of their estate, you will hear the rustle of pages turning in the wind. And if you listen too closely, you may even hear the voice of Margaret Hartwell herself, still dictating to the shadows, writing the future of a family that was never meant to survive. Samuel Hartwell was different from the rest of his family. Born in 1818, he grew up surrounded by whispers of curses, deformed cousins locked away, and rituals that echoed through the night. Unlike his parents, however, Samuel showed a fascination with the world outside the estate. He read voraciously, and by the age of 15, he had secretly begun corresponding with ministers and doctors in nearby towns. Neighbors remembered Samuel as unusually pale, with piercing green eyes and a calm, measured voice that carried both intelligence and unease. He was polite, too polite, they said, as if his manners were learned by mimicry rather than instinct. Yet there was something else. Farmers claimed that animals grew restless when Samuel was near, dogs barking and horses pulling at reins until they foamed with panic. By his early 20s, Samuel had inherited the Hartwell estate after the sudden deaths of his parents. The local physician recorded their demise as fever, but rumors told a darker tale: blood found in basins, burn marks on the floor, and a stench that lingered in the halls for weeks. At first, Samuel seemed determined to reform the family's reputation. He opened portions of the estate to visitors, allowed local workers to farm on Hartwell land, and even attended town meetings. For a brief moment, the curse seemed to be lifting, but the facade cracked quickly. Guests who stayed overnight at the estate described hearing voices through the walls, though no one else was present. Others swore Samuel vanished for entire nights, only to reappear in the morning with blood on his cuffs and a distant look in his eyes. Some even claimed to have seen him in 2 places at once, standing at the chapel while also walking the fields. The final straw came in 1841, when Samuel himself disappeared. One stormy night, a group of townsfolk reported seeing a column of fire rising from the estate's chapel. The ground shook as thunder rolled overhead, and a noise, half human, half animal, was said to echo for miles. When they investigated the next morning, the chapel was intact but empty. The altar was scorched black, the floorboards splintered, and Samuel Hartwell was nowhere to be found. Some said he had been consumed by the curse his family had nurtured for generations. Others believed he had performed a final ritual, sacrificing himself to join whatever presence the Hartwells had worshipped. Yet not all believed Samuel was gone. For decades afterward, travelers told of a man who appeared on lonely Kentucky roads. He was pale, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and always asked the same question: "Do you know the name Hartwell?" Those who answered yes claimed he smiled, showing teeth too sharp to be human, before vanishing into mist. Samuel Hartwell's body was never found, but in the folklore of Kentucky, his disappearance marked a turning point. The family was no longer just cursed, they had become something worse, something that could not die. By the mid-19th century, the Hartwell estate was mostly abandoned. The main house rotted, the chapel sank into the earth, and the fields went untended, but the land itself seemed unwilling to let go of its darkness. Farmers who attempted to buy portions of the property quickly abandoned them. Crops withered no matter how carefully they were tended, wells filled with water that tasted of iron and left livestock vomiting blood. Hunters who camped on the land woke to find their rifles rusted overnight, their firewood soaked as though by unseen rain. Most disturbing of all were the voices. Travelers who passed through the abandoned Hartwell fields at night reported hearing whispers in the wind, sometimes prayers, sometimes screams. Horses refused to cross the property lines, and children who strayed too close returned home pale, unable to explain why they suddenly felt watched. In 1853, a group of local men attempted to burn the Hartwell estate to the ground. They doused the crumbling house in oil and set torches to the walls. Yet, as the flames rose, a sudden downpour struck, extinguishing the fire as if the storm had targeted only that patch of land. When the men fled, one failed to return. His body was discovered days later lying on the chapel steps, his face frozen in terror, his chest marked with the Hartwell sigil, the triangle and spiral scene carved across the property. The land's curse spread further still. Families who moved into neighboring farms complained of strange illnesses and livestock born deformed. Some even believed the Hartwells had sown their bloodline into the soil itself, binding their legacy to the earth so that it would never fade. The Kentucky legislature eventually ordered the land seized, hoping to sell it to developers, but each attempt failed. Surveyors quit their jobs after hearing children's laughter in the woods. Investors backed out of to receiving anonymous letters warning them to leave the dead to the dead. By the turn of the century, the Hartwell estate was no longer simply abandoned, it was forbidden. Locals refused to step foot there, and maps began to omit its exact boundaries. In time, even the roads leading to the estate grew over with trees, as though the earth itself was conspiring to erase it. Yet the curse was not confined to Kentucky. Descendants of the Hartwells, scattered by marriage and secrecy, carried pieces of the family's darkness with them. Wherever they went, stories followed: sudden fires, unexplained deaths, children born with haunting deformities. The Hartwell curse was not a place, it was not a family, it was something older, deeper, something that clung to both blood and soil, feeding on memory, refusing to die. By the late 19th century, whispers of a last Hartwell began to surface. The family had all but vanished, their estate left to rot, their name spoken only in hushed tones. Yet rumors persisted that one bloodline remained intact, a hidden descendant carrying the legacy of America's most disturbing genetic mystery. Her name, according to scattered records, was Eleanor Hartwell. Born in 1872, she was said to have been raised in secrecy by distant relatives who attempted to conceal her true heritage. But those who encountered Eleanor swore she carried the unmistakable Hartwell mark. Pale, almost translucent skin, and eyes so piercing that few could look directly into them. In her early years, Eleanor lived quietly, but tragedy followed her everywhere. Teachers at her school claimed books fell from shelves whenever she entered. Neighbors whispered of pets vanishing overnight, their bones later found arranged in strange patterns. Suitors who courted her often met sudden misfortune, accidents, fevers, or in one case, disappearance without explanation. By 1896, Eleanor had moved to Louisville, where she became something of a recluse. She rented a small home but rarely left, her windows always shuttered, her lamps burning at odd hours of the night. Locals claimed that on certain evenings, shadows could be seen moving across her curtains, shadows that did not match her figure. One chilling account came from a doctor summoned to treat Eleanor after a fainting spell. He later wrote in his diary that her veins appeared black beneath her skin, as if the very blood inside her body was corrupted. When he attempted to take a sample, the glass vial shattered in his hands. He refused to return. Eleanor lived in isolation until her sudden disappearance in 1901. Her home was found abandoned, her possessions neatly arranged, but her body gone. On the table lay a single item, a journal rye, 10 in her hand. Its final entry read, "The blood calls me back. I cannot resist it any longer. The book is waiting." To this day, no one knows what became of Eleanor Hartwell. Some say she fled the country determined to end her line. Others whisper she returned to the ruins of the estate, swallowed by the same darkness that had consumed generations before her. But there are those who believe Eleanor never truly vanished. Reports continue to surface, sightings of a pale woman with piercing eyes walking country roads at dusk, always silent, always watching. Some insist she has survived for more than a century, carrying the curse forward, ensuring that the Hartwell legacy can never truly die. The Hartwell family's greatest mystery was never the estate, never the deformities, nor even the whispers of witchcraft. At the heart of their curse lay a book, a manuscript so strange, so dangerous, that even speaking of it aloud carried risk. Known only as the Testament of Blackwood, the manuscript was rumored to be written in a language no scholar could translate. Some believed it was Latin twisted beyond recognition, others thought it a cipher invented by the Hartwells themselves. But those who glimpsed it agreed on one detail: the handwriting seemed alive, as though the ink writhed across the page when touched by candlelight. Local accounts trace the manuscript back to the late 1600s, when the first Hartwell patriarch arrived in Kentucky. He was said to have carried only two possessions from the Old World, a small chest of gold and the book wrapped in black cloth. Where he acquired it, no one knew. Some whispered he had stolen it from a monastery in Europe. Others claimed it had been gifted to him by a man who was not human. The book was passed from generation to generation, always hidden, always guarded. When neighbors accused the Hartwells of devilry, they pointed to the manuscript as proof. But despite many attempts, no outsider ever managed to steal it. Guards were placed at night, priests sent to bless the estate, yet the book remained. It was said that those who tried to touch it without Hartwell blood would fall ill within days, coughing blood, their skin breaking into lesions, their minds shattered by whispers no one else could hear. In the mid-1700s, a traveling scholar named Matthew Klein claimed to have been invited into the Hartwell Library to examine the manuscript. His notes, preserved in fragments, describe something almost unbelievable. The pages are skin, the ink is red, not brown, and glistens as though freshly spilled. The words twist as I look at them, refusing order. I fear this is not a book meant for men. Days later, Klein was found wandering the woods, naked, raving about the spiral inside the triangle. He died soon after, his body covered in burns, though no fire had touched him. The Testament of Blackwood was not merely a book, it was a voice. Hartwell descendants wrote of hearing it whisper in their sleep, promising power, knowledge, and escape from death. Some resisted, locking it in iron boxes, burying it beneath chapel floors. Yet always it returned, unearthed, found in locked drawers, sitting on tables where no one had left it. By the time of Eleanor Hartwell's disappearance in 1901, the manuscript had become legend. Her final journal entry, "The book is waiting," suggests she had at last succumbed to its call. Whether she read it, burned it, or carried it into the earth with her, no one knows. But scattered reports through the 20th century describe a pale figure leaving behind pages, loose sheets of skin-like parchment marked with twisting script. Those who touched them fell ill, those who read them vanished. The book was not gone, it was multiplying. And if whispers are true, fragments of the Hartwell manuscript circulate even today, passed in secret auctions, locked in private collections, waiting for the next willing heir to open its cursed pages. The Hartwell family's greatest mystery was never the estate, never the deformities, nor even the whispers of witchcraft. At the heart of their curse lay a book, a manuscript so strange, so dangerous, that even speaking of it aloud carried risk. Known only as the Testament of Blackwood, the manuscript was rumored to be written in a language no scholar could translate. Some believed it was Latin, twisted beyond recognition. Others thought it a cipher invented by the Hartwells themselves. But those who glimpsed it agreed on one detail: the hand writing seemed alive, as though the ink writhed across the page when touched by candlelight. Local accounts trace the manuscript back to the late 1600s, when the first Hartwell patriarch arrived in Kentucky. He was said to have carried only two possessions from the Old World, a small chest of gold and the book wrapped in black cloth. Where he acquired it, no one knew. Some whispered he had stolen it from a monastery in Europe. Others claimed it had been gifted to him by a man who was not human. The book was passed from generation to generation, always hidden, always guarded. When neighbors accused the Hartwells of devilry, they pointed to the manuscript as proof. But despite many attempts, no outsider ever managed to steal it. Guards were placed at night, priests sent to bless the estate, yet the book remained. It was said that those who tried to touch it without Hartwell blood would fall ill within days, coughing blood, their skin breaking into lesions, their minds shattered by whispers no one else could hear. In the mid-1700s, a traveling scholar named Matthew Klein claimed to have been invited into the Hartwell Library to examine the manuscript. His notes, preserved in fragments, describe something almost unbelievable. The pages are skin, the ink is red, not brown, and glistens as though freshly spilled. The words twist as I look at them, refusing order. I fear this is not a book meant for men. Days later, Klein was found wandering the woods, naked, raving about the spiral inside the triangle. He died soon after, his body covered in burns, though no fire had touched him. The Testament of Blackwood was not merely a book, It was a voice. Hartwell descendants wrote of hearing it whisper in their sleep, promising power, knowledge, and escape from death. Some resisted, locking it in iron boxes, burying it beneath chapel floors. Yet always it returned, unearthed, found in locked drawers, sitting on tables where no one had left it. By the time of Eleanor, Hartwell's disappearance in 1901, the manuscript had become legend. Her final journal entry, "The book is waiting," suggests she had at last succumbed to its call. Whether she read it, burned it, or carried it into the earth with her, no one knows. But scattered reports through the 20th century describe a pale figure leaving behind pages, loose sheets of skin-like parchment marked with twisting script. Those who touched them fell ill. Those who read them vanished. The book was not gone. It was multiplying. And if whispers are true, fragments of the Hartwell manuscript circulate even today, passed in secret auctions, locked in private collections, waiting for the next willing heir to open its cursed pages. For decades after Eleanor's disappearance, the Hartwell name was believed extinct. But extinction was never an option. The curse demanded continuation. In 1923, reports emerged of a young man in Tennessee, Thomas Blackwell, who bore an uncanny resemblance to portraits of Samuel Hartwell. He was tall, pale, with unsettlingly sharp features and eyes that glowed green in certain light. His lineage, when traced, revealed adoption records and lost family ties. Scholars soon whispered what locals already suspected. Thomas was no Blackwell. He was a Hartwell in hiding. Thomas carried with him peculiar habits. He avoided sunlight, preferring long walks under the moon. He spoke fluent Latin, though he had never studied it. And in his possession, always wrapped in cloth, was a single object, flat, rectangular, and heavy. Neighbors distrusted him. Crops failed near his farm. Children woke screaming after glimpsing his shadow through their windows. One man swore Thomas did not cast a reflection. Another insisted he saw Thomas standing in the church at dawn, even though others swore he had been miles away at the same moment. By the late 1930s, Thomas had married, and his wife bore him a son. She died mysteriously weeks later, her body discovered with deep bruises across her chest, as though hands larger than human had crushed her. The death certificate read, "cardiac arrest." The townsfolk whispered otherwise. His son, David Hartwell, would carry the curse into the modern age. Unlike his father, David lived among people. He attended school, played baseball, even served in the military during World War II. Yet everywhere he went, soldiers remembered strange accidents. Vehicles overturned without cause. Radios picked up voices in unknown tongues. In France, his entire unit vanished during a night patrol, except for David, who returned unscathed, his uniform soaked in blood, not his own. After the war, David relocated to Ohio, changed his name, and tried to disappear. But history has a way of dragging the Hartwells back into light. Neighbors found symbols carved into his basement walls. His children complained of voices at night. His wife filed for divorce, writing in court records that David was not human when the moon is full. The Hartwell bloodline had not ended. It had merely evolved. From Samuel to Eleanor, from Eleanor to Thomas, from Thomas to David, the family adapted to modern times. They hid under new names, new towns, new occupations, but their curse remained intact. Their bloodline still whispered. And if the rumors are true, David's descendants live on today, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that the curse sleeps in their veins, waiting, always waiting. By the late 20th century, the Hartwell family had transformed from local legend into national obsession. Paranormal investigators, journalists, and amateur ghost hunters flocked to Kentucky to uncover the truth. But what they found was far more terrifying than ghost stories. In 1974, a group of college students from Louisville snuck into the ruins of the Hartwell estate with tape recorders and cameras. Only 2 returned. Their recordings captured whispers, unintelligible at first, then clear. "You should not be here." The survivors never spoke of what they saw. Their eyes, wide and empty, told enough. In the 1990s, a popular television crew attempted to film a documentary on the Hartwell curse. They set up equipment near the chapel ruins. Within hours, their cameras malfunctioned. Batteries drained, lenses cracked, microphones recorded voices even when the crew was silent. When the footage was developed, it showed not the ruins, but scenes of people in 18th century clothing, faces pale and distorted, walking in silence. The crew abandoned the project. Modern researchers point to genetic evidence. In 2003, a medical historian published a paper suggesting the Hartwell curse might have been an extreme genetic disorder, Marfan syndrome, porphyria, or something yet unnamed. But the paper was retracted after the researcher was found dead in his office, his body surrounded by spiral symbols drawn in his own blood. Today, the Hartwell estate remains sealed off by local authorities. No trespassing signs warn thrill seekers to stay away, but the temptation is too strong. Urban explorers upload shaky footage of the crumbling chapel, always claiming to hear children laughing in the distance. Some never return. But the most chilling investigations come from digital spaces. Online forums claim that fragments of the Testament of Blackwood have been scanned and uploaded, though viewing them is said to bring nightmares and hallucinations. Some users insist entire threads vanish overnight, as if erased not by moderators, but by something else. The Hartwell mystery is no longer confined to Kentucky. It spreads through word of mouth, through digital screens, through bloodlines scattered across America. The question is no longer if the curse is real. The question is, who carries it now? If there was one symbol that defined the Hartwell curse, it was the spiral. From the earliest carvings in the chapel walls to the bloody sketches found on Eleanor Hartwell's bedchamber floor, the spiral recurred again and again. At first glance, it seemed harmless, just a simple coil drawn in a single stroke, but the spiral was not decoration, it was a map. In the journals of Matthew Klein, the scholar who briefly examined the Testament of Blackwood, he wrote, "The spiral is not a shape but a doorway. To look upon it too long is to step inside it." Over the centuries, witnesses described strange behavior linked to the spiral. Children of the estate were found drawing it compulsively on walls, floors, and even their own skin. Servants swore that staring at the spiral carved into the chapel floor made the air ripple like water. And in more than one account, a Hartwell heir vanished directly after gazing at it for hours, as though the spiral had consumed them. Local priests claimed it was a demon's mark, a trap for souls. But others, secret societies, scholars of the occult, even high-ranking Freemasons, believed it to be something older, a geometry not of Earth, but of elsewhere. The spiral infected the modern era too. When paranormal investigators brought cameras into the Hartwell ruins, their lenses sometimes captured spirals of light hanging in mid-air. One photograph, later leaked online, showed a spiral etched into the grass itself, perfect, symmetrical, and burning faintly in moonlight. Scientists who examined the photo dismissed it as an exposure trick. Those who had been there swore it was real. The most disturbing accounts came from survivors. In 1989, a woman who broke into the ruins claimed she saw a man standing within the spiral. His skin was grey, his eyes hollow. He spoke a single phrase, "You should not be here." When the woman blinked, he was gone. But when she returned home, she found the spiral carved into her front door, though no one in her family admitted to making it. Was the spiral a summoning sign, a gateway, or the Hartwell family's prison key? Scholars remain divided, but all agree on one point. Wherever the spiral appears, so too does the curse. It has not faded. It has adapted. Today, teenagers sketch it in notebooks, graffiti artists spray paint it on abandoned buildings, and digital designers unknowingly embed it into logos. Each repetition strengthens its pull, spreading the Hartwell curse far beyond Kentucky. And perhaps, right now, as you listen, the spiral has already begun its slow rotation in your mind, drawing you closer to the center where something waits. For decades, rumors persisted that one final Hartwell remained alive, hidden somewhere in America. In truth, there was not one, but many. David Hartwell's descendants, scattered by war and migration, continued the bloodline in silence. Most tried to bury their past, a few embraced it, and one, known only as the last heir, dared to resurrect it. In 2007, a genealogist researching Civil War soldiers traced the Hartwell name through marriage records and military archives. To her shock, she discovered living descendants in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and California. When she attempted to contact them, every letter was returned. Her phone calls were met with static. Weeks later, she vanished. Her unfinished manuscript was discovered on her desk, its final sentence unfinished. "The last heir walks among us." By 2012, whispers emerged of a man who bore the Hartwell mark. He was never named in public records, but those who encountered him described the same traits: unusual height, unsettling eyes, a voice that seemed to echo even in small rooms. He traveled under false names, appearing at occult gatherings, underground auctions, and private seances. Some said he carried a fragment of the Testament of Blackwood, a page of living parchment that whispered in his pocket. Others claimed he had embraced the spiral fully, tattooing it across his chest in a ritual said to bind the bloodline to the shadow. What made him terrifying, however, was not his existence, but his purpose. Unlike his ancestors, who fled the curse or suffered it in silence, the last heir welcomed it. He did not see the Hartwell bloodline as cursed. He saw it as chosen. In 2016, a private recording surfaced on the dark web. A grainy video, filmed in a candlelit basement, showed a man reciting words in a twisting language. Behind him, figures stood motionless, their eyes blank, their mouths slightly open. At the end of the recording, the man looked directly into the camera. His eyes glowed faintly green. The uploader titled the file, "The Last Heir Speaks." Within days, the video disappeared from every platform. The accounts connected to it were deleted, but those who had seen it claimed that his final words were clear. The Hartwell line does not die, it becomes. No one knows where the last heir is today. Some believe he has gone underground, gathering followers. Others whisper he has merged with the spiral itself, no longer bound to human form. But if the curse is to spread, if the manuscript is to awaken again, it will be through him. The last heir is not a victim. He is a herald. And so we return to the question that has haunted Kentucky for 3 centuries. What is the Hartwell curse? Is it a disease of the blood, a haunting of place, or something older, something that bends reality itself? The truth is more unsettling than any single answer. The curse is all of it. It is blood and land, manuscript and spiral, air and shadow. It is a net cast over centuries, pulling everything toward a single point in time. The Testament of Blackwood, if truly alive, may not be a book at all, but a vessel, an anchor from something beyond our world. The spiral may not be a symbol, but a geometry that bridges dimensions. The Hartwells themselves may not be victims, but chosen vessels, molded generation after generation until one would accept their fate fully. The curse is not ending, it is evolving. Even now, people report strange encounters, a pale figure glimpsed on highways, whispers in hotel rooms where Hartwell descendants once stayed, spirals appearing in frost on car windows. In the digital age, the curse has learned to travel differently. It does not need manuscripts or bloodlines, it needs only attention. And here lies the most terrifying revelation. Every retelling of the Hartwell story strengthens it. Every whispered rumor, every YouTube video, every podcast, every curious listener adds fuel to the spiral. You, right now, are part of it. Because the Hartwell curse is not bound to Kentucky anymore, it does not sleep in graves or old manuscripts. It lives in memory, in words, in stories. And once you've heard it, once the spiral has entered your mind, there is no escaping it. The curse does not die. The curse does not end. The curse continues through you.